Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Leora moved through Rusalka Forest like someone who had learned to vanish by practice. Moonlight braided itself through pines and painted pale maps on roots. She heard two small cries, sharp and thin, that snagged at her chest. Under a torn root, she found two pups, fur matted with rain and blood, trapped in a rusted snare. The wire had bitten into their skin, and they shivered close, as if warmth could stitch life together. Her hands were skilled with nets and ropes, but unpracticed with lives in shock. Still she knelt and worked. She cut the wire with a small blade and murmured as she worked, as if words could steady fear. One pup tucked its muzzle under the other and opened an enormous, muddy eye that grabbed her like a lighthouse. She wrapped them in her scarf, feeling their faint heat against her chest and the weight of responsibility settle like a stone. Behind her the forest watched with a patient animal attention, shadows holding counsel of silence. She rose with the two small bodies secured and walked the narrow path back toward Mara's Hollow, each step a promise to the soft things. By the time she reached Mara's Hollow, the news had already spread like spilled oil. Market boys pointed and whispered, and grown men moved their baskets away from her hands. Red Jory shoved through the crowd, jaw set, as if accusation were a weapon he wielded with skill. Leora set the pups on straw at her yard and began cleaning their wounds with careful fingers. Mira watched from the doorway, face mapped by years of labor, eyes raw with worry and fierce pride. Rumors curled toward her like smoke, and the town judged with the blunt tools of fear and habit. Then a presence that changed the temperature entered the square, a man wrapped in a coat that smelled of pine and storm. He moved with authority, not cruel but absolute, and when he stopped the crowd quieted. His name sounded like a thing of distance and command, Kalamar, whom the village already recognized as an alpha. The arrival made the whole square feel smaller, as if each person had to hold their breath until the man decided which way the tide would turn. Kale approached without ceremony and examined the pups, as if reading a map of lineage. His eyes found the marks that named a bloodline and the pattern of fur that carried old stories. When he looked at Leora, his gaze measured her like a ledger, weighing a single act against the needs of many. He touched a pup gently, and his manner held the authority of someone who understood cost and consequence. Then he spoke, voice even and small but carrying like a bell. "Tomorrow I will choose." The sentence landed on the village like a thrown stone and set gossip circling with new hunger. People spun theories, mate, leader, alliance, each story a different shape of possibility and fear. Leora felt each whisper press into her skin while she held the pups close and felt their fragile heat. She had rescued them and now found her private mercy folded into public law in a way that made her breath short. The market's murmur turned into a waiting drumbeat that matched the quick pulse of the pups in her arms. That night Leora could not sleep, the alpha's words replayed like a drumbeat against her ribs. She sat by the hearth and listened to the pups' small, uneven snores, each breath a claim to be kept. Mira set a bowl of stew beside her and touched the back of Leora's hand in a gesture that mixed fear and blessing. At dawn she wrapped the pups and set the corroded button from her father's coat into the palm of her hand like a vow. The ridge path was narrow and the wind argued with her steps, testing her resolve with each clipped breath. At the edge of the trees Kale waited where stone met forest, his coat taking the light like weather. He did not offer florid speech. He inspected the pups and then spoke of a danger approaching from the north. His manner made it clear their survival had larger bearings than the village rumor mill could hold. Leora felt the world tighten to an urgent thread. Her mercy had threaded her life into a net of other people's fates. She stood in the ridge circle with the pups held close and listened to the valley below like a distant rumor. Choice now wore a public face and a private cost. Return to the sea and quiet, or step into a life bound to the pack's rules. She turned the corroded button over in her fingers and thought of her father's absence and her mother's steady hands. People in the village would judge by gossip and habit. The pack would judge by usefulness and courage. Being chosen by an alpha was no fairy tale but a reconfiguration of obligations that could save or consume a life. The pups shifted in her arms, tiny hearts beating a fragile drum against her chest, and she felt the gravity of every future step. Kale's eyes met hers, and in that instant nothing about the world was quite the same. He said nothing, but the sentence hung between them like law. Tomorrow would come with its own light and reckoning. The ridge listened as if the land itself waited to see which path she would follow. Leora breathed, tightened her scarf, and held the pups close. The alpha's words echoed in the hollow. Tomorrow I will choose. Leora's childhood had been braided between tidestones and the hush beneath her mother's roof. Mara's hollow lay where the sea sighed against black rocks and fishermen mended nets like prayers. Her father had gone one autumn, swallowed by a storm that left only a broken oar and a pocket of silence. Mara learned to fold absence into daily bread and to speak little of loss. As a child, Leora preferred listening to wolves at the forest's edge to learning the needlework the other girls practiced by the hearth. She would hide on crags where the sea could not find her and watch the wolves' silhouettes sketch sentences across moonlit moss. They spoke in a language of weight and wind that answered questions the village never asked aloud. People called her strange for sitting on the rocks with salt in her hair and animal stories in her throat, but she learned to read footfalls and to know storms by the way the pines bent. When a mother wolf once left a scrap of hide on her doorstep, Leora pressed it to her chest and felt a tether tighten, a small promise that the world held more than nets and whispers. That promise grew into a stubbornness, an insistence that small, wounded things deserved rescue even if the town measured deeds by marketplace habits. After the pups were rescued, Mara's hollow measured Leora with a keener eye. Red Jory, who counted coin and status with the same hungry precision, found new reasons to carve her into the town's narrative. He called attention to her in the market as if shame could be made a public commodity. Neighbors who had once traded fish for sewing work now crossed the lane to avoid her. Myra's face folded into lines of worry and quiet pride. She pressed a hand to Leora's when buyers looked away. Despite gossip, Leora tended the pups with a single-minded tenderness that was both practical and holy. She fed them slivers of fish, made calming broths, cleaned each wound with fingers steady from mending nets, and sang nonsense lullabies to still her own pulse. The pups learned her small sounds and breathed more evenly under her watch. Their survival felt to her like the only honest thing she could claim. Yet every act of care pulled her further into the village's politics, where mercy could be twisted into accusation. Kale's arrival the morning after changed the scale of what Leora had done. He came with a retinue that moved like tide and weather, men and women who carried authority in the set of their shoulders. When Kale examined the pups, he did it as if reading a ledger. He looked at scars, at the pattern of fur, and at the small signals that told of lineage and luck. He was a man who had learned the cost of every life under his charge, and his voice carried the weight of decisions the village could not fathom. He asked Leora where she had found them, and when she told him, he listened without pity, but with a kind of precise sorrow. On Blackfen Ridge, he later disclosed, quietly and with the economy of a leader, that the pups carried bloodlines someone might kill for, traits that could strengthen the pack in seasons of disease or drought. The revelation translated Leora's private mercy into public consequence and left her feeling both proud and used, as if her kindness had been folded into an argument larger than she had imagined. She realized then that a single act, saving small lives, could reroute the course of many others. Rumors hardened into rules with an inevitability that made Leora dizzy. Red Jory lobbied the council for ordinances that would regulate who could take in wolf pups and which houses were permitted to shelter dangerous animals. The council convened in the old hall with its sagging beams, and Leora found herself answering questions that felt like trials. Do you understand these creatures? Are you willing to hand the pups to the lodge? Can you live under the pack's rules if given sanctuary? Each question sought to measure not only her intentions, but the degree to which her life might alter the town's rituals. She answered plainly. She had rescued what was injured and wanted them safe. Sometimes truth is a blunt instrument under fear. Sometimes it is a shield. Mira pressed the corroded button from her father's coat into Leora's palm, as if passing along a talisman. The button felt like a promise and a ledger both, a reminder that choices would be counted and debts paid in ways both brutal and merciful. That night Leora walked the shoreline with the pup's faint breaths in her memory and the corroded button warm in her palm. Sierra took salt to her hair and made the button taste like iron and promise. She pictured the lodge on Blackfen Ridge with its circle of wolves and thought of Kale's steady face. Leaving the village would mean risking the only small steadiness she had. Staying might mean letting the pups become targets in a politics she did not trust. She imagined her life as a map. Paths she had already walked, Myra's kitchen, the market, the rocky edge, and new paths that opened toward a lodge where decisions were made in the language of survival. She measured fear, pride, and duty like coins and realized they were never equal in value. As the moon rose, Leora made a quiet, certain decision. She would go to Blackfen Ridge to learn the shape of what she had started. It was not a triumphant choice or a surrender, but a pragmatic step into a wider world where mercy became responsibility and a small act of rescue could become the hinge upon which many lives turned. She folded her father's absence into quiet courage, holding the pup's fate like a small lantern. She vowed to guard that light through storm and law, regardless of consequence or fear and time. Morning crept into Mara's hollow like a nervous guest. A fine mist curled through the streets, softening the edges of gossip that had hardened overnight. Leora rose before dawn, her body already tuned to the rhythm of worry. The pups slept in the basket by her bed, breathing slow, their small ribs rising and falling beneath fur that gleamed faintly in the firelight. She had spent the night thinking of Kale Amar, the Alpha King, his eyes gray as winter water, his calm voice that somehow carried thunder behind it. He had said he would choose, and that word sat in her mind like a stone dropped into deep water. Choose what? Or who? The village had its own answers. By now, half of Mara's hollow whispered that Leora had bewitched him, the other half that she had angered him. Either rumor was dangerous. When she stepped outside with her basket of fish heads for the pups, faces turned away. The air itself felt watchful, expectant. Even the gulls seemed quieter, as if the whole coast were waiting for the Alpha's decision to crack the day open. At mid-morning, hoofs struck the lane, rhythmic, confident, drawing every head toward the road. Kale Amar had returned, not alone this time. His riders moved like pieces of an unspoken command, each turn, each stop, perfectly timed. The wolves came first, their paws silent on the stone, eyes alert. Behind them, Kale dismounted with the precision of someone used to being obeyed. His presence drew the world into sharper focus. Even the gull's wings seemed to still midair. Leora met his gaze only once before lowering her eyes to the pups in her arms. He approached, cloak brushing the dirt, and knelt without ceremony to examine them. "They live," he murmured, voice low, more statement than praise. The village crowd thickened behind him. "Because of you." Leora almost laughed at that. Her? She had no power, only stubborn hands and an instinct to save. But Kale wasn't looking at her like a man humbled by charity. He looked at her as if she'd broken a rule he didn't know how to punish. Then he stood, his shadow falling over her. "Come to Blackfen Ridge at nightfall," he said. "You've tied your fate to mine whether you meant to or not." The journey to the ridge felt like a sentence and a calling woven together. The forest swallowed the path ahead, ancient and humming with secrets. Every branch seemed to whisper warnings. The air was cooler, filled with pine and the copper scent of rain. Leora walked beside Kale's second-in-command, a woman with silver hair braided tight to her skull. "You shouldn't have touched the pups," the woman said quietly. "No one outside the pack dares." Leora held her tongue, though the words formed sharp in her mind. If no one dares, then who saves the helpless? They reached the ridge as twilight peeled across the sky. Blackfen Lodge rose from the rock like a fortress grown from the mountain itself, timbers darkened by time, wolf carvings watching from every lintel. Inside, firelight-painted faces, warriors, elders, healers. Kale stood at the center, one hand resting on a great gray wolf whose eyes glowed gold. Leora realized the truth then. The wolves were not beasts beside the people. They were the same. Two shapes, one soul. Kale's gaze caught hers, and something in it stripped away the noise of fear. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked, voice quiet but slicing through the hall. "You saved the heirs of my bloodline. My kin. Their mother was hunted by men who crave wolf blood for power. You found what was left of her hope." He stepped closer, and the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. "I told my pack I would choose," he continued. "And I have." The hall tensed. "You." Leora froze, the words striking her chest like thunder. Laughter rippled from the crowd, derision, disbelief, a sharp-edged sound. Kale silenced it with a glance. "This woman risked exile to save what is ours," he declared. "Her courage speaks more loudly than lineage." Leora's breath caught. She felt every stare burn against her skin. Her throat ached to speak, to deny whatever people thought this choice meant, but no words came. Kale looked at her like a man accustomed to obedience, yet testing the waters of something unfamiliar. She couldn't tell if this was honor or captivity. When the meeting ended, the ridge emptied in cautious murmurs. Kale approached her again outside, where moonlight dripped like melted glass over the stones. The wind smelled of pine sap and snow. "You don't understand," he said, softer now, as if trying to undo his own decree. "The forest sees intention, not permission. You've bound yourself to my world. Whether you walk with us or against us, the wolves will follow your scent now." His words made no sense, yet they sank deep, like prophecy. Leora met his eyes and, for the first time, saw exhaustion there, an ache buried under authority. "Then tell me what you expect of me," she whispered. Kale's jaw tightened. "Only that you stand where you already are. The rest," he hesitated, something unspoken catching behind his teeth. "The rest we will decide together." Then he turned away, leaving her in the clearing with the scent of wolves and rain in her lungs. The pup's faint whimper rose from her basket, a small sound of life that grounded her against the immensity of what she'd stepped into. Above, the moon slipped free of cloud, silvering her hands as she whispered to herself, "What have I done?" The forest, as always, gave no answer. The morning after the choosing, Blackfen Ridge arranged itself like a place ready for verdicts. Fog curled through the rocks, making the lodge's dark timbers look like a silhouette in a dream. Leora woke in a small room carved from stone, the pup's quiet breathing a slow metronome down the hall. She strapped the corroded button to her dress and moved through spaces where wolfskins hung like old flags and weapons leaned like patient trees. Everywhere there were signs of lives lived in close weather, repaired leather, bowls scored by use, children's toys braided from rope. The pack gathered in a ring at the ridge's edge to hear Kale speak of danger and law. Leora felt oddly exposed, an outsider who had become central without permission. She listened while Kale described the northern hunters' trade in wolf parts, how it had hollowed families and made weakness profitable. His words were spare and exact, the way a surgeon speaks before cutting, grim, necessary, leaving no room for sentiment. As he laid out the stakes, the pup's lineage carrying a gene that could resist a wasting sickness that had claimed many packs, Leora's private act hung between them like a fulcrum for larger consequence. Every face in the ring widened with a new gravity. Some regard was reverent, some cold as calculation. She realized then that what she had done was no longer a single life saved. It was a lever the pack would attempt to use to push away future ruin. After the meeting, Sarah, the silver-haired second, led Leora aside and spoke without sugar. "This is not about thanks," Sarah said, her voice thin as wire. "The ridge needs stability. The pups must be integrated, trained, and guarded. You will stay until they are old enough. You will learn our ways." The directive sat like a stone in Leora's hand. She tasted the iron of obligation and the sweet rust of pride, mixed. Sarah showed her the training yard where young wolves practiced hunting and the infirmary where herbs steamed and bones mended. Leora watched as the pups, now rubbing sleep from eyes and stretching into awkward lengths of limb, took tentative steps among wolves who moved with practiced caution. Kale watched from the lodge's steps like a man who had planted himself against the wind. Later, when the work slowed and the ridge hummed with a softer, domestic rhythm, Kale approached Leora with an intensity that made her forget lessons and laws for a moment. "There are watchers on the high road," he told her. "Men who would take what we guard." His hand hovered near the small scar on her wrist where the snare had cut, an absent-minded gesture that anchored them both in a private geography, a map of past pain and present care. Leora's days at the Ridge became a study in small economies, the exchange of labor for belonging. She learned to mend traps so they would not maim, to braid ropes that would not bite flesh, to cook broths that would draw fevered wolves out of delirium. Each small skill threaded her to the lodge's rhythm. The pack taught her a language of utility, how to read spoor for lies, how to tell whether a trail had been baited, how to stitch a wound so that pride did not complicate healing. Nights were the hardest, when the wolves' howls stitched the dark and she could hear the echo of the sea in her bones, reminding her of what she had left behind. Villagers came sometimes to barter. Sacks of grain for protection, fish for passage, children given lessons in how to respect the Ridge's rules. Leora mediated these exchanges like a small diplomat. Her market knowledge and common sense became valuable, binding her more tightly to the pack's interests. Rumors from Mara's Hollow arrived like messages in bottles, some in praise, others in malice. Red Jory's voice surfaced in some of them, sharp as a splinter, accusing her of bargaining her life for power. Each rumor stung, but the Ridge offered her a different kind of testimony, daily work that proved her intentions in practical increments. The deeper she settled into this doubled life, the more fractures she noticed, old resentments, ancient agreements stretched thin, and the personal costs of public usefulness. Kale's authority worked in two modes: practical decisions that steered the pack's survival and private moments where his human vulnerabilities leaked through. One twilight, after a patrol had returned with a wolf whose leg was shattered by a cruelly hidden snare, Leora found Kale on the ridge alone, the lines of his face drawn like a map of losses. He told her, halting at first, and then with a clarity that surprised her, about the wolves he'd failed to save as a younger man and the weight that made him stern. "Being alpha is learning to choose what to let go," he said, glancing at her with tired eyes. She recognized in his confession a kinship with her own long memory of her father's absence, choices measured against loss. Their conversation skinned away the public ritual and left two people stitched together by similar longings and fears. There was an intimacy in being witnessed by someone who had to make impossible calls. Kale's steadiness was both comfort and challenge. Leora felt herself drawn into an orbit that asked for courage beyond rescue work, courage to stand beside a man whose every decision might cost someone dearly. As spring moved toward a fragile summer, the Ridge itself became a theater of small dramas that often read like parables. A young apprentice wolf refused to obey a hunting call and was ridiculed for cowardice. An elder healer argued that mercy should sometimes override the pack strictures. A boy from the village sought Leora's help in returning a lost lamb and was taught how to track gently without leaving a mark. In these moments, Leora felt both the sternness of law and its warm counterweight, compassion. She crafted small acts of reconciliation, teaching a gruff hunter to mend rather than maim, showing a fearful child how the wolves could be read like books, convincing an elder to let a younger wolf live despite a misstep. Her life became a ledger of tiny salvations. Yet always, beyond the Ridge's harmony, the northern hunters remained a shadow on the edge of the map, cunning and patient. Kale's decisions tightened around that threat like a glove closing on a hand. Leora began to see her rescue as a hinge. The day she had freed those pups now pivoted the lives of many. She understood with a sharpness that sometimes stung, that saving one small life can tilt an entire world toward either ruin or rescue depending on the stewardship that follows. The pack's hearth smelled of char and pine, and a patience that had learned to wait through hunger. Leora arrived at dusk with a small basket of fish and the corroded button from her father's coat in her palm like a secret. Inside the long lodge, she found a rhythm that felt like a different grammar. Wolves at tables, people sharing the economy of need, conversations short as arrowheads and full of practical tenderness. Kale watched from his seat as she took in the space, measuring the angles of her shoulders with a steady attention. Her first lessons were blunt. How to clean a snare without tearing skin, how to tie a knot that held weight without cutting flesh, how to read a trail for deceit. Kellen, the hunter who had lingered when she found the pups, taught her silence and the precise use of tools. Each small skill became proof she belonged somewhere besides the margins. At night she lay awake by the hearth listening to wolves talk in low voices and feeling that her hands might change more than one life. The lodge taught her dignity in work. The pack rewarded usefulness more readily than any market's praise. Nights by the fire were sometimes filled with music, stones struck together, a low drum of hoof and hand, and other nights with quiet repair. The wolves' lullabies were a language without words, a cadence Leora felt more than understood. It settled her like a tide on shells. Sarah, whose silver hair and scars mapped years of storms, taught Leora how to bandage a torn paw and how to speak the pack's blunt truths without flinching. Elders told stories of treaties older than Mara's Hollow, tales of hunters who once bled packs for coin and of packs struck with the sea's fishermen. Kale listened when the elders spoke, and sometimes his gaze found Leora as if he measured how she might stand under harder winters. Their conversations were spare. The lodge valued economy of speech, and every sentence carried consequence. In private moments, Leora glimpsed Kale's human edges, the smallness of regret at losses he could not undo and a fatigue that belonged to a man who bore many lives in his choices. Those intimacies built a fragile bridge. She crossed it very slowly. Rumors traveled back to Mara's Hollow like tides finding small inlets. The market's hum shifted to a scrutinizing buzz. Some offered grudging respect, others sharpened old malice into new weapons. Red Jory, a man whose temper had become a constant shadow over the market, turned his venom toward Leora with fresh cruelty. He mocked her in lanes, tore up bandage bundles, and whispered that she had sold the village for a place near Kale. The pack responded with steady measures rather than sudden fury. Kale brought wood to Myra's doorstep and paid for fish at the stalls, small acts that rearranged gossip like careful hands. Leora accepted the gestures with mixed gratitude. She would not be a charity case, but the help softened certain barbs and showed the village the alpha's intent without a sermon. Her life began to feel like a ledger of obligations where kindness and duty were the same coin. The more she healed, taught, and stitched, the more the town's stories shifted from suspicion to a wary cooperation that still carried old scars beneath its surface. She fought for autonomy with quiet stubbornness, refusing ownership by pity and insisting on value carved from her own labor. The true test arrived one night when the northern hunters returned, not with bargaining smiles, but with plans honed into cruelty. They laid snares like invisible fences and baited paths to catch the unwary, aiming to take wolves alive for grisly trade. When traps began to pick off prey and a sentry returned with blood on his flank, the pack answered like a single organism, silent, efficient, unforgiving where necessity required. Leora rode with them, a scarf around her throat and a satchel of herbs at her hip. She moved with a new confidence earned through long hours of practice. In the skirmish, Sarah took a wound along her arm, and Leora's hands moved without thought to bind and soothe, her stitches steady and true. Kellen fought by her side, his face both fierce and frightened. Where he had once faltered, he now stood as proof that penance could harden into courage. The hunters finally retreated with curses and empty sacks, beaten by a resistance honed by many small lessons. When the lodge settled after the fight, Kale looked at Leora differently, less as an outsider who had saved pups and more as a comrade who had proven usefulness under fire. Always. In the slow dawn after the fight, the lodge smelled of smoke and herbs and the patient labor of mending. Wounds were stitched, names counted, losses named with voices rough as rope. Leora sat by a low fire, hands still stained with ash and blood, while the pups, fierce and shaggy now, nuzzled her like kin searching for the map of comfort. A complex pride warmed her. She had taught herself enough to be useful. She had turned instinct into practice skill. Belonging had its costs beyond danger. Visibility meant scrutiny, and every act of courage would be counted and used in many languages. She felt the weight of expectation settle like a cloak. Some nights she welcomed it. Other nights it chafed until she considered retreat back to Mara's Hollow and the sea's uncomplicated indifference. Kale sat opposite her, watching the fires like someone measuring time. He did not offer praise, but his steadiness said what words could not. Between them was an unspoken truth. The life she had chosen was no simple romance, but a labor of shared burdens that would demand courage measured by deeds, not declarations. She vowed to keep small lives safe, whatever the cost required now. The frost came early that year, creeping down from the ridge like a quiet conqueror. Mara's Hollow braced itself with fires and gossip in equal measure. Smoke coiled from every chimney, carrying stories of alliances, betrayals, and the woman who had crossed the line between humans and wolves. Leora rose before dawn each day, wrapped in her indigo scarf, her breath white in the air. She had grown leaner since the harvest, her movements economical, her gaze steadier. The ridge had hardened her without taking her gentleness, though she rarely laughed now except when the pups, almost grown, played rough and foolish in the snow. They were strong, swift, and curious, and their presence in the lodge felt like a heartbeat that kept the pack alive. Still, whispers bled down the mountain, that the Alpha King had chosen his mate not for bloodline but for pity, that the sea witch from Mara's Hollow had woven a spell. Leora ignored them, but words have teeth even when you do not feed them. Each day she felt them gnaw a little deeper. Red Jory's bitterness had not frozen with the fields. He was too clever to challenge Kale outright, but cruelty finds its ways through corners. He spoke to merchants and travelers, spreading tales that the ridge demanded tribute and that Leora was its mouthpiece. Men who once sold nets began to hide their wares when she came to town. Mira endured it with a quiet strength that had always steadied Leora, but age had carved new hollows beneath her eyes. One morning, she pressed her daughter's hand over the hearth and said softly, "You don't owe this place your peace." But Leora couldn't leave. She had given her word, to the wolves, to the ridge, to Kale, though she still didn't understand what their bond meant beyond survival. That night, Kale came down from the ridge to the village, walking among the stalls like any other man. When Red Jory mocked him, calling out that wolves have strange appetites, the Alpha didn't raise a hand. He simply bought Myra's fish at twice their worth and thanked her by name. It wasn't dominance, it was discipline. And it silenced the square more effectively than violence could have. Later, by the river where moonlight bled silver across the current, Kale found Leora waiting. She had come there to escape the press of the village's stairs, but his quiet steps found her as if drawn by the same unease. "You could have let me handle it," she said, her voice taut. "You shouldn't have had to." Kale shook his head. "There are kinds of battles that can't be fought with claws. Let me bear this one." He looked older in the moonlight, the scars at his temple catching the pale glow. "You've taught us how to speak to humans without losing our pride. That matters." His words should have comforted her, but they opened a wound she hadn't named. "And what am I to you, Kale?" she asked. "A symbol? A story to calm the pack." His silence was long enough for the river to answer with its own restless murmur. When he finally spoke, it was softer, almost fragile. "You are the reminder of what mercy costs, and why it's worth the price." The words settled like frost, beautiful and cold. As winter deepened, the ridge grew restless. Wolves sensed change before humans spoke of it, an edge in the wind, a rhythm in the earth. Hunters had begun to move closer again. Their traps were clever now, disguised in ways even seasoned scouts missed. Kellen, once forgiven and trusted again, found one near the southern glade and destroyed it with Leora's help. They worked side by side, her hands red with cold, his eyes full of quiet remorse. "I still dream about the ones I failed," he confessed. "Dreams don't ask permission to haunt," she said, knotting rope with fingers gone numb. Together, they freed 3 snared foxes and 1 small wolf who would have bled out by dawn. Kellen smiled then, a tired, grateful thing. "You could have been a healer anywhere," he told her. "Why stay here?" She hesitated. "Because I couldn't watch the world break and do nothing." When they returned to the lodge, Kale met them at the gate, his gaze unreadable. Later that night, when she slept, Leora dreamed of standing between 2 fires, the villages and the ridges, and feeling them both reach for her like hungry hands. Spring arrived in slow mercy. The snow melted into soft rivers, and the forest exhaled. The pups, grown now into wolves sleek and sure, ran through the thawed glades, testing their strength against wind and memory. Leora walked among them, her coat patched with age and yews, her eyes tired but bright. The hunters retreated north again, leaving silence in their wake. Peace, fragile and temporary, settled like dust. At the first market after the thaw, Mira sold her fish without insult. Red Jory's name was a bitter echo, his exile now a lesson in the village's songs. And at night, when the ridge burned with firelight, Kale and Leora sat side by side without needing to speak. The world would always test its fragile covenants, but for now, they had earned stillness. Kale reached for her hand, rough from work, and held it between his palms. "The fault lines are there," he said quietly, "but they hold because we stand on them together." Leora leaned against him and watched the stars scatter like embers. For the first time in months, she let herself believe that peace, no matter how brief, was still worth fighting for. Winter's lessons turned into questions that tested loyalties. The ridge read like a ledger where every action was a line item and every silence an entry. Wolves moved with a patience that made human anxieties look impulsive. Leora learned to breathe on that rhythm. Kellen's absence left a space that gossip tried to fill. Some called him coward, others a casualty of greed. The northern hunters had retreated, but their shadow lingered, like a bruise someone keeps touching to see if it still hurts. Children who had once pointed at Leora as a curiosity now watched the wolves with awe and fear tangled together. Mira mended nets in the morning and worried at the edges of sleep. Kale walked the ridge at dusk and listened to the plain of his pack as if every murmur were a report. Leora kept her hands busy, mending, boiling, teaching young apprentices to weave safer snares, because hands that move make fear more bearable. Beneath all of it pulsed a quieter urgency. The pups Leora saved had blood that might save or doom the pack, and that truth hung over every conversation like a cloud waiting to burst. No one could guess how fragile hope was. One evening a messenger arrived from a distant coastal village bearing news that made the lodge hold its breath. A sickness was spreading among packs across the region, an ailment that ate the bright-eyed pups first and left nothing but shadows. Kale read the letter with hands steady as carved stone, then folded it with a precision that made Leora's fingers itch to help. The elders argued about quarantine and trade, about sending trained scouts to learn the sickness's path. Sarah proposed a plan to send the pups, for a season, to shadow patrols where they could grow tempered without exposure to infected waters. Leora wanted instead to keep them close, to wrap them in herbs and her own stubborn courage, but she also understood that proximity might be a death sentence if the sickness were contagious. Disagreement showed itself in small ways. A bowl left empty, a silence at a hearth, a glance that lingered too long. The lodge's politics were practical and sharp. Survival required debate and then decisive action, not sentiment. Leora learned to argue with precision and to accept decisions even when they cut against her muscle memory of protection. She swallowed each compromise like medicine. Tensions rose further when a trader named Harsk visited, bringing with him promises of remedies and the tang of coin. He claimed to have tinctures that would cure the new sickness if only someone would deliver live wolf pelts for study. His eloquence wrapped greed in a ribbon of expertise, and some of the lodge's more practical minds began to imagine stability, bought rather than earned. Leora distrusted him instinctively, His smile was too fast, and his eyes too calculating. Kale met with Harsk under the old ash and listened like a man who sifts promises for hidden hooks. After the meeting, a small clique suggested selling passage rights and trading one litter's protection for a store of medicines. Sarah's face hardened. Medicine without ethics breeds new cages, she said. Leora argued passionately against modifying the pups, insisting the pack seek cures through safer collaboration with coastal healers and shared quarantine protocols. The debate split voices like glass. That night Leora slept poorly, dreams full of wolves caged and pups pale under hot lamps. She woke determined to keep Mercy from becoming merchandise. Her resolve grew like iron forged in the lodge's quiet. She would not betray the pups ever. Tension at the lodge matured into a harsh lesson when scouts returned with reports of a new trap design, a net glazed with pitch to prevent scent, set by men who had learned to think like wolves. It caught a volunteer patrol and left one wolf fatally ensnared before Sarah, and Leora cut him free at great cost. The morning that followed was raw, immediate, and public. Names were called, vows sworn, and a plan made to hunt the hunters if they did not cease. Kale called for a council in which he spoke not as conqueror, but as carrier of consequence, outlining a strategy of disruption, destroying supply lines, seducing trade away, and making the hunters' ventures unprofitable. Leora proposed teaching villagers safer methods and establishing a network of watchers. Her plan was practical, stitched from both village knowledge and lodge discipline. The council accepted a combined approach. Yet even unity had edges. Some members feared escalation while others wanted retribution. In the days that followed, Leora felt the strain between justice and revenge like a taut rope. She knew how quickly righteous anger could slide into cruelty when fear guided the hands. She urged care while the lodge prepared. In the quiet that followed the council's decision, Leora walked among the wards with a steadier step. The Watchers' network was set. Villagers would ring bells for patrols, scouts would change trails at random, and trade caravans would be rerouted. Leora taught children not only to mend nets but to spot snares and to leave markers that fooled scent. The pups grew stronger. They learned to read human hands and to respect the delicate negotiations that kept both species alive. Kale watched these changes with a careful pride, sometimes smiling at small victories, a saved fox, a traitor turned honest, and sometimes growing distant as his mind wrestled with future risks. One evening, as the sun burned the horizon orange and the wolves sang into the dusk, a messenger arrived bearing a small wooden box wrapped in oilskin. Inside was a token from a distant healer who agreed to collaborate, seeds for a bitter herb that could bolster pups' resistance when brewed correctly. The lodge celebrated with quiet gratitude. Leora held the seeds like a new responsibility, knowing that every cure would require labor, patience, and the vigilance to prevent greedy hands from transforming remedy into commerce. She vowed to guard them. The thaw came too fast that year. Rivers rose and cracked through ice like veins of anger, flooding fields and stirring restless energy in the lodge. It was the kind of season that made mistakes feel inevitable. The hunters had vanished into the forest months ago, yet their presence clung to the ridge like smoke that never dispersed. Wolves began returning from patrol with small wounds, arrows fletched with unfamiliar feathers, cuts that smelled faintly of oil and metal. Kale's calm thinned, his jaw a constant knot. Leora sensed the weight behind his silence, the strain of a leader who had to measure each response against the survival of everyone else. Sarah advised caution, but pride crept through the pack like frost through roots. When a patrol returned one evening with a missing scout, tempers snapped. Kale called for an immediate counterstrike. Leora begged for a night's pause to plan. "They want us reckless," she warned. "Don't give them what they want." But grief is louder than wisdom. Before dawn, a small hunting party rode out without orders. They didn't return. By midday the ridge was chaos. Wolves howled for their lost. The villagers below whispered that blood debt would bring ruin. Leora found Kale at the edge of the ridge, hands braced on a stone, as if he could hold the world still. "They'll keep taking," he said, voice stripped of its usual calm. until they believe we bite harder. His anger was the quiet kind that frightened her more than any roar. Then let me plan the strike, she said. You lead the pack, but I know how humans think. He turned to her slowly, and in that look she saw 1,000 decisions balanced on a blade. You would risk that? He asked. They won't spare you, because you speak their language. She met his eyes. They won't spare anyone. I'll do what's needed. That night she gathered Sarah, a handful of scouts, and the grown pups, now wolves sleek with youth, and sketched a trap made from the hunter's own arrogance. It involved decoy trade routes, falsified signals, and a clearing that would collapse under fire when triggered by water, weight, and flame. It was brutal, desperate, and just clever enough to work. The plan unfolded under a sky bruised purple with storm. Leora led the false caravan, a handful of villagers and wagons piled with empty crates, her scarf wound tight against the wind. In the trees, Kale's pack lay waiting, motionless as carved statues. The first arrow came before the second breath. Leora ducked behind the wagon as men emerged from the trees, eyes glittering under helms made of stitched hide. Now, she whispered. A spark flared from her flint, lighting the oil they had scattered through the clearing. Fire leapt upward, and at that signal the wolves surged. The ambush became inversion. Hunters trapped by their own design, their escape routes flooded by streams diverted hours before. Screams tore the air, short, shocked sounds swallowed by the crackle of fire and the rhythm of claws. Leora's part was to guard the rear, to shepherd the villagers out. But in the chaos she saw Kellen, who had joined to redeem his earlier betrayal, fall to a hidden trap, the iron jaw closing around his leg. Without thinking, she ran to him. "Leave me," he gasped, but she would not. She jammed her blade into the mechanism, splitting her palms as she pried it open. The metal groaned, then gave way. Kellen fell free, his blood soaking the snow. "Don't let this be for nothing," he whispered, before his breath shuddered and stopped. When the last echo of battle died, the clearing looked like the skeleton of a fevered dream, smoke curling, embers floating like fireflies, wolves limping through wreckage. The hunters had scattered, leaving their dead behind. Kale approached, his face a mask carved from exhaustion and rage. "We lost 4, he said flatly. "And him." His eyes flicked toward Kellen's still form. Leora's throat locked. "He saved me. He saved us." Kale knelt, closing Kellen's eyes with a gentleness that broke something inside her. The pack carried their fallen home wrapped in the hunters' torn banners. The cost of victory pressed heavy on every back. That night the ridge was silent. No drums, no songs, just the hiss of snow melting on firewood. Leora washed her bleeding hands, her cuts stinging like small truths. When Kale joined her, he did not speak for a long time. Then, quietly, "You were right about planning, but I was right about blood. It always asks for more." He looked older than she had ever seen him, and for the first time, she feared that even triumph could hollow him. The next day the ridge buried its dead. Each name spoken was a chord in a song of resilience and warning. The wolves dug shallow graves in frozen soil, their movements rhythmic, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Mira came up from Mara's hollow with food for the mourners, her presence reminding Leora that even grief required tending. As dusk settled, Kale stood before the pyre. "The hunters will not return," he said, his voice carrying through the cold air. "But peace is not the absence of enemies, it's the discipline to live without becoming them." He looked at Leora then, and for the first time, the whole pack saw what lived unspoken between them. It was not softness, it was trust, hard-earned and fragile. When the pyre flared, its light painted their faces gold, and Leora felt both proud and undone. The breaking of things had reshaped them all, cut away illusions, burned out cowardice, forged in pain the beginnings of something that might, if guarded carefully, become lasting. The fire cracked, sparks rising like stars, and she thought of Kellen's last words, "Don't let this be for nothing." She swore she wouldn't. Not ever. The days after the battle were marked by silence, the kind that doesn't rest, only hides its trembling under routine. Snow melted into mud, washing blood from stone, but not from memory. The wolves limped less with each dawn, though their eyes held the memory of fire. Leora spent her days binding wounds, patching gear, and training the young wolves who had survived their first war. Yet something in the ridge's air had shifted. The pack had changed from an order of survival to something sharper, aware of its power, aware that its boundaries had been rewritten. Kale had grown quieter, his gaze distant, and though he shared meals beside her, his thoughts roamed far beyond the firelight. One evening he summoned the elders and the council. "It is time," he said simply. "We cannot live between worlds any longer." Leora watched him from the shadows, a cold understanding creeping through her. He was going to speak of the choosing, the one everyone had whispered about since the night she found the pups. The words she had feared, denied, and hoped for in equal measure had finally reached their hour. The announcement came the next morning. Kale called the ridge and the village together, wolves, villagers, traders, even Mira leaning on her cane. The square, once divided by fear, now stood united under wary curiosity. Kale stepped into the open, his cloak of ash gray fur swirling behind him, his authority unspoken yet absolute. Leora stood at the edge, unsure if she wanted to vanish or stand taller. "You know our story," Kale began, voice carrying through cold air. A woman who crossed the boundary of blood and saved what the forest had nearly lost. A village that learned its fear was not its strength. And a pack that learned survival requires more than claws. His eyes found hers. This world can no longer be two. From this day forward, there will be one law, ours, written together. Murmurs rippled like wind through grain. He turned to her fully. "Leora of Mara's Hollow," he said, his tone formal yet burning with something deeper. "You stand where mercy began and peace followed. You are my choice, not a consort or a token, but my equal, my mate in law and life, if you will it." The square erupted, some in cheers, others in outrage. The old prejudices fought for breath, while hope pressed against them. Red Jory, exiled but watching from the crowd's edge, spat on the ground. "She bewitched you," he shouted. "No human can lead wolves." The crowd split in reaction, half ready to defend, half ready to condemn. Leora felt the world tilt. Her name was now a dividing line. Kale raised a hand and silence obeyed. "You mistake loyalty for enchantment," he said coldly. "You mistake blood for worth. She has done more for this ridge than any who claim purity. If there is any who disputes it, speak now, and I will answer as Alpha." Red Jory stepped forward, foolish and trembling, but driven by spite. "Then I speak," he said. "No beast commands my kind." He drew a blade, a fisherman's knife, crude but sharp, and lunged, not at Kale, but at Leora. The movement was fast, stupidly human. She saw the blade only when it flashed near her face, but she didn't flinch. Before she could react, a blur of silver intercepted. Kale's wolf, the great beast that had watched over the pups, collided with Jory and sent him sprawling. The knife clattered, blood splashed across snow, and gasps froze midair. Kale stood over the fallen man, fury controlled but lethal in its precision. "You attack my choice, you attack my law," he said softly, a tone that frightened more than a roar would have. Jory coughed, reaching for his weapon, but Kale's foot pressed it away. "You wanted to be remembered," he said. "Now you will be." He did not kill him. He stripped him instead. "Red Jory of Mara's Hollow," he declared, "you are exiled from the valley and the sea, by wolf and by man. You will walk without a name until you learn what it means to serve something greater than yourself." The villagers didn't cheer. They simply stepped back, allowing the punishment to settle into the earth. Leora's heart pounded. She could not decide if she wanted to cry or run. That night, under a full moon that painted the ridge in silver fire, the pack gathered for the binding ceremony. It was not what the village imagined. No crowns, no vows of subservience. Only two figures standing between fire and moonlight. Kale placed his hand over Leora's heart, the old mark of recognition between equals. "You could have refused me," he said softly. "I would have understood." She shook her head. "I didn't save those pups to live small again." His mouth curved, faint and real. "Then stand with me, and we'll make something neither wolf nor human alone could have built." The pack howled, not in dominance, but in witness. The sound filled the valley, echoing off stone and sea until even Mara's Hollow's fishermen paused mid-cast to listen. Leora felt the vibration of it under her ribs, a chorus that said you belong. When the howling faded, Kale turned to her again. "From this day, our law is mercy with teeth," he said. And she, trembling but sure, echoed, "And courage without cruelty." At dawn, the village square was quiet, the world freshly rearranged. The hunters had fled, the law had changed, and the people who once whispered now watched her with a mix of awe and uneasy respect. Mira approached, tears in her eyes. "You've done what your father never could," she said. "You've made the world listen." Leora smiled, her heart aching with love and fatigue. Kale stood beside her, no longer a distant king but a man carved by storms and softened by choice. Together, they looked over the ridge as sunlight spilled down the valley. "They'll test us," she murmured. "Every season." He nodded. "Then we'll answer every season." The two pups she'd saved, grown now, strong and wild, bounded toward them, circling their feet before racing down the slope toward the sea. Leora watched them go, her scarf trailing in the breeze. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "we begin again." And in that moment, the forest, the sea, and the sky seemed to agree. The seasons turned, and with them, the valley learned a different kind of rhythm. What had begun with blood and fire softened into something enduring. The wolves no longer hid from the village. They walked its borders as sentinels, their shadows stretching long across dawn fields. Fishermen left portions of their catch at the forest's edge as tribute, and in return, no traps went unsprung, no child lost to winter hunger. The ridge had become more than a refuge. It was a promise made visible. Leora moved easily between both worlds, her hands as skilled with fishnets as with herbal poultices. She had grown into her place as if it had always waited for her. The pups she had once wrapped in her scarf now ran with their own litters, strong and clever, the keepers of the peace she and Kale had forged. Yet beneath the beauty of it all, Leora never forgot the cost. Each choice they had made was a thread tied to a grave, each victory carrying the weight of names carved into the lodge's stone wall. Even peace had its maintenance, and she carried that labor like a second heartbeat. Kale ruled differently now, less as a king, more as a steward. His orders had become conversations, his silences, invitations for counsel. Together, he and Leora restructured the pack's laws, creating what they called the Covenant of Roots, a shared code that bound wolves and humans alike to mutual survival. "We guard the living," the first line read, "and honor the fallen not by vengeance, but by building what they protected." Some resisted at first, wolves who believed humans too fickle, villagers who still feared teeth in the dark, but the results silenced doubt. The trade routes prospered, diseases waned, and hunters found the valley's defenses too costly to challenge. Even Myra's shop flourished, her fish now a sought-after delicacy cured with herbs from the ridge. She laughed once, shaking her head. "Never thought I'd sell to wolves and men alike." In small moments like that, Leora saw what she had dreamed. Not perfection, but coexistence built from sweat and patience. The kind of peace no one writes songs about because it takes too much work to keep alive. Still, there were nights when quiet carried its own weight. Leora would walk alone through the forest paths, the moon catching in her hair, listening to the wolves' low songs threading through the trees. The sound no longer frightened her, it steadied her. Sometimes she thought she heard Kellen's laughter in the wind or saw the gleam of his old knife half buried in the soil. Loss doesn't fade. It roots itself differently, becomes part of the landscape. At the ridge's highest point, where Kale had once stood before his people, she kept a small cairn of stones. one for each life given to make this fragile balance possible. She didn't pray there. She simply sat, breathing with the world, letting her heartbeat fall in rhythm with the wolves' howls below. Kale often found her there. He never spoke when he did, only placed his hand over hers until the silence turned companionable. Love, she had learned, didn't always need words. Sometimes it was just the shared act of stillness in a world that rarely paused. Years began to fold one over another like pages in a well-read book. The Pups' descendants filled the forest with their lineage, silver, black, and russet coats glinting through pine and snow. The villagers' children learned early to tell friend from predator, reverence from fear. Once a year, on the eve of the spring thaw, both villages and wolves gathered at the clearing by the old river, where they shared food, music, and stories of what had been lost and what had been kept. It became known as the Festival of Bonds. The first time Mira attended, she stood beside her daughter and whispered, "You brought them back to one another." Leora smiled, watching children dance with wolf pups under the flickering torchlight. Kale approached her then, his eyes soft with the years, his hand rough with calluses earned not from fighting but from mending. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. She turned to him, remembering the girl she'd been, the one carrying 2 frightened pups through the rain. "No," she said. "If mercy is a chain, then I'll wear it gladly." He smiled then, the rare kind that reached his eyes, and kissed her hand as the forest sang around them. When Leora grew older, the villagers began calling her the Keeper of Roots. It was not a title she sought, but one earned by presence. Even after her hair silvered, she could still be found walking the ridge at dawn, checking the snares, scattering herbs, whispering to the wolves who followed at a respectful distance. When Kale's strength finally waned, he asked to be buried not in the Hall of Alphas, but beside the first cairn, the one built after Kellen's death. "Let me rest near the ones who kept me honest," he said. Leora honored his wish. The night he passed, the forest howled until dawn, a sound so vast and mournful that even the sea paused to listen. She lit a single candle in the window of their home and sat beside it until morning, the flame flickering like a heartbeat. Years later, when she too became part of the ridge's earth, people said the wolves kept vigil at her cairn for 7 nights. No one dared disturb them, and when spring returned, a single white flower grew between the stones, small, wild, impossible to uproot. Generations later, the story still traveled in whispers, of a woman who saved 2 wolf pups and changed the fate of kingdoms. Children asked if it was true that the Alpha King had chosen her because she defied him. Elders only smiled. He didn't choose her, they'd say. He recognized her. And every year, when the moon swelled full over Rusalka Forest, the wolves would gather and howl, a long, mournful, beautiful sound that seemed to carry her name. Leora's covenant endured, not carved in stone but kept alive in every act of small mercy, the untied snare, the shared meal, the human hand that reached toward fur without fear. The forest, the sea, and the village lived by the same quiet law now. To save one life is to guard all that breathes. That was her legacy, the law of roots. And long after her bones had turned to dust, when storms raged and peace trembled, people still told her story in one simple sentence. She saved 2 wolf pups in the forest, and the next day, the Alpha King made his choice. If that story moved you even a little, if you felt the cold of the forest, the fire of the battle, or the heartbeat of mercy that changed everything, don't just scroll away. Hit subscribe right now so you don't miss the next story waiting in the shadows. There are more tales like this, of love that defies the wild, of courage born in silence, of people who choose mercy even when it costs them everything. Tap the bell, drop a comment with your favorite moment, and join this growing pack of dreamers from around the world. Because in this pack, we don't just listen to stories, we live them. Full Moon Wolf Face. Subscribe, and I'll meet you in the next moonlit story.